Welcome everybody back to Humi 9, where we'll be discussing Buddhism this week. Now last week when we discussed Hinduism, we began our lectures with a question that I hoped provide some way of relating to the material. Last week we began by asking, have you ever felt like you were in a dream? And now after reviewing Hinduism, maybe you can see how this question was related. This week, the question I'd like to begin with is the following. Have you ever been overwhelmed? Have you ever been trapped by suffering? If you can relate to this experience, if you can bring to mind being trapped by suffering or being overwhelmed by life, you may be better able to grasp the material that we'll be discussing for the next few lectures together. So once again, let's take a visual tour of Buddhism so we can get a feel for what we'll be discussing for the next few days. Maybe the first thing that comes to mind to you is the idea of the Buddha, the person of Buddha. Maybe various Buddhist statues come to mind with various different types of forms representing Buddhism. You notice how we have two different types of images here, and you see a stark contrast with the following. Maybe Buddhist temples come to mind. And again, because Buddhism is found all throughout Asia, there will be different aesthetics to the temples, different types of architecture. Maybe Buddhist altars. Maybe the first thing that comes to mind to you is Zen Buddhism, or the Zen aesthetic, simplicity, natural, or the feeling of tranquility, perhaps. Maybe monks come to mind as you think about Buddhism. Or maybe it's the practice of meditation. So as we begin to discuss what Buddhism is, let's go ahead and ground ourselves. Let's take a look at where it originated. Now, Buddhism starts in India, in the northern part here that we call Nepal, we currently call Nepal. And you can see how Buddhism has spread all throughout Asia. Now, Buddhism is going to be founded by one individual and one individual's teachings, yet we see a spread of the teachings based upon this, originating from this one single area, all throughout Asia. And the question that we'll look at in a second is, how did this, what was the motivation, or how did this occur, where teachings of one individual seem to catch on all throughout the region? We can begin answering the question by thinking about how there was a particular individual, an emperor, that was so remorseful about the violence of war, the horrors of war and conflict, that he helped spread the teachings of the Buddha over this 30-year period. But as we take a look later, there might be more to the story of why this might be such a popular religion in the region. Buddhism is often thought of as having three major branches. There is the Theravada branch. Theravada is translated to mean way of the elders. This is the term that they've given themselves, way of the elders. It's often thought of as the oldest form because it traces its heritage to the oldest text within Buddhism, which is the Pali Canon. Pali refers to the language that the text is written in, and the Pali Canon contains various teachings, various thoughts of the teachings, and it's said to be the word of the Buddha, but it's pretty much taken for granted that a lot of what's in there comes from the Buddha himself, but also from various teachers of Buddhism. There's Mahayana Buddhism. It's often seen to be a more liberal approach that doesn't strictly follow the Pali Canon, and they claim to be able to extract Buddhist teachings from sources outside of the Pali Canon. And then we also have Vajrayana Buddhism. When we think of Vajrayana Buddhism, it might be useful to just think strictly of the Tibetan Buddhism that you may be familiar with from the Dalai Lama. Tibetan Buddhism, Vajrayana Buddhism, it claims to have secret teachings or hidden teachings that are beyond the Pali Canon, that come to us through various other modes of communication. So let's take a look at the Buddhist story. A common misconception is the idea that Buddha is the name of a person. It's not. It's a title or it's a description. Right? Buddha means enlightened or awakened one. The historical figure that we'll be discussing when we discuss the Buddha is Siddhartha Gautama. And as we'll find out, the story says that he was born in a very wealthy sort of family. Notice the time period of 563 BC. So before Siddhartha's birth, it is said that his parents were visited by an angel, and the angel foretold that their son was to have one of two paths. Either he could become a great ruler, a great king of a kingdom, or he would live and become a great redeemer or savior of the world. The parents, hoping to keep their son within the kingdom, and thinking that being a ruler of a kingdom would be more fruitful and maybe less of a burden, decided that they would try their best to make sure that their son would follow the path of becoming a great king. However, in order to do that, they were told that the Buddha, or Siddhartha, has to stay within the kingdom. And that they have to make sure that if they want their son to grow to be a great king, that he had to not have any desire to leave the confines of the kingdom. Otherwise, if he were to leave, then he may choose to take the path of the Redeemer of the world. So, if you can imagine, if you're a parent, what would you do to make sure that your child doesn't leave your house? Make sure the child doesn't leave where you are from, or he originates. What they did is they decided to make the life of Siddhartha within the kingdom as desirable as possible, to make sure that there was no reason that their son would want to leave. So that meant that they made his experience within the kingdom as a pleasant experience as possible. They kept him away from sights and that may disturb Siddhartha. So eventually, though, as he gets older, the young son decides that he's curious. He wants to leave and see what's outside the kingdom walls. One of the first things he sees when he does that is an individual with white hair, an individual that's hunched over, that walks strangely, has strange skin. Siddhartha asks, "What is this?" to his guard. And his guard says, "This is what we call aging. This is old age." But Siddhartha was taken back by this. I've never seen an individual look so frail like this. That's unusual. Next, it is said that he sees an individual on the ground, coughing, seemingly too skinny to even stand up for himself. Siddhartha asks, "Well, what is this? What's this noise? What's this individual that can't even walk?" The guard says, "This is what we call illness. This is what we call sickness." Again, Siddhartha is taken back. He had never seen this before in his kingdom. The third thing he sees is a body on a platform being taken away by some of the people of the town. And the body was not moving. The body seemingly was asleep. Siddhartha asks, "Well, what is that? Why is that person not walking? Why are they not carrying themselves to wherever they want to go?" And the guard says, "Well, Siddhartha, that's death. That's what happens to all of us. We all die." Siddhartha was disturbed by this notion that at one point we go to sleep and never wake up again. Lastly, they see an individual that is able to walk. It's not coughing, that doesn't have the white hair and the unusual skin, yet they are dressed in a way where they have renounced all of their possessions. They seem to be poor by choice. Siddhartha asks, "What is this? Why would somebody choose to live this way?" The guard says, "Well, that's a monk. That's somebody that has given up worldly possessions in order to gain wisdom, spiritual knowledge." So all of this bothered Siddhartha. sickness, death, old age. How can I deal with this now that I've seen it for the first time? I must do something about this, he said to himself. So he did. He decided to leave his family, to go search for answers, to go find the truths that could help him, help those who were suffering. So what did he do? He had just seen a monk give up all that they had owned in order to search for wisdom. So he then renounced all that he owned. He became a monk himself, a beggar. Through this practice, an answer to his questions of how to alleviate suffering, death, and old age did not come to him. So he decided to find wisdom teachers. Remember, he grew up in India, so Hinduism is the religion within the region. So he met with various gurus and swamis and other spiritual teachers and became a student. It was said that he was one of the best students. Yet through this interaction, this personal interaction with various teachers, he was unable to find the answer that he was seeking. So he decided to live a life of an ascetic, not aesthetic, but an ascetic, which means one who renounces bodily pleasure, bodily desires. So he would go days without eating, days without drinking, in order to transcend the limitations of the body. This practice did not help him attain, or at least did not immediately help him attain the answers that he sought. And he noticed that this practice seemed too extreme also. So he decided to simply sit under a tree and meditate. The tree that he sat under is known as the Bodhi tree, right? The tree of enlightenment. And he sat here and meditated in a fashion similar to what we discussed last week with regards to Raja Yoga. It is said that through 40 days and 40 nights of sitting and meditating under this tree, he was tempted by various evil spirits to participate once again in bodily pleasures, bodily desires, in order to break the concentration of his meditation. On the 40th night, it is at this point that he had an awakening. He came to a realization about the nature of reality, the nature of the human condition, and how human beings can deal with that condition. And it is at this realization that it is said that Siddhartha was then replaced with who we now call the Buddha, or the first Buddha. And from this point forward, he would teach, he would spread his knowledge of what insights he had gained through this experience. And from a small band of students, this became the prominent religion in the East. I should say a prominent religion in the East. So what I'd like you to think about is, based upon what we read for today from Smith, what do you think was the cause for how this religion that began with one individual was able to spread to so much of the Eastern world? From the text, Smith makes the argument that Buddhism seems to be an empowering religion. Unlike the brand or the form of Hinduism that many people had been practicing at this period of time, the time of the Buddha, where one was supposed to be giving themselves to a deity or worshiping various deities, Buddhism seemed to be beyond any sort of authority, seemed to be beyond any sort of need for following specific rules from the local guru. What we see in Buddhism is we see no authority figure. There's no rituals involved. Unlike Hinduism, which has this metaphysical mythology about how we come from Brahman and that we are reincarnated, Buddhism does not, at least within the Pali Canon, within Theravada Buddhism, there's not much speculation about metaphysics. Though, as we'll see later on, within some branches of Buddhism, there is also, they seem to bring in and inherit some of the mythology of Hinduism with reincarnation. But from the Pali Canon, what we see from what most people think of as being the original Buddhist teachings, there's much less emphasis on this sort of philosophical, metaphysical speculation. Buddhism, because it is founded by this one individual, did not have a tradition at the time, at least. Instead of these things, what the Buddha seemed to preach was how one could work for themselves, not rely on other people, on teachers or priests, but to rely on themselves and their own actions in order to deal with the world's aches and pains. The Buddhist teachings also were devoid of anything supernatural. They weren't speaking of how we needed to do anything with deities or relied on gods and saints. Instead, it was all based upon our individual effort. This might also be a religion that appealed to many people because there seemed to be a balance in one's life that was promoted by the Buddha. You weren't supposed to live your life of indulgence, yet you also weren't supposed to live a life of complete ascetic. Instead, the Buddha said, one must follow a middle way. Thirdly, Smith says, it's possible that people were attracted to Buddhism because it seemed very rational. It seemed to be a very pragmatic, a practical approach to living one's life. You don't have to, once again, you don't have to rely on spirits and deities like we saw with Hinduism. Instead, it's about your actions and how you psychologically deal with the circumstances of your life. The Buddha seemed to say that what I am teaching, I learned through empirical methods. Empirical means you learn through experience. So you try it, right? You participate in it. You follow the teachings. And if the experience is not there, then you know something is wrong. Don't simply follow what I say. Don't simply believe what I am telling you. Experience it for yourself. Try it for yourself. And your experience will be the guide for whether or not this works. As you can imagine, within other religions, the emphasis is on following practices, following teachings, in spite of maybe what one experiences. One must follow what you say, these people say, because you're supposed to. Within Buddhism, the Buddha emphasized, no. You follow what I say because it works for you. So you try it, and if it works, then good. If it doesn't, then maybe this isn't, at least the way you're understanding what I'm teaching isn't right. So in this sense, we can think of it as very pragmatic. The emphasis also is in the psychology, is in your mind and how you think, rather than metaphysical sort of claims about where we come from and what we do in our lives and how we are reincarnated. One need not be born within a particular class. One need not be rich. One need not even be well-schooled to take advantage of Buddhism. In that sense, it's very egalitarian. Everybody is equal in this sense. There's no advantage based on age, no advantage based upon gender. Everybody can participate within the religion and gain its benefits equally. Buddhism also is very individual. You don't need to rely on other people for you to progress and do it well. And maybe now you can see how people, having been exposed to Buddhism, might be attracted to it based upon these sorts of factors. The last thing that may make Buddhism popular within the region is the fact that there is a very clear and simple goal within the religion. Right? And that goal is simply to end suffering. Remember, within Hinduism, we talked about escaping the wheel of samsara. The Buddhist teachings can be simplified as having the goal of ending suffering, of alleviating suffering, or if you'd like, of alleviating unhappiness. And he gives a very clear prescription. Well, the prescription is simple, When we discuss it, it may be not so clear, but this prescription is very simple. It's simply to follow an eightfold path that the Buddha prescribes. Now, the key, at least for many Buddhists, the key to escaping suffering and the purpose of what the Eightfold Path does to us has to do with changing the perspective we have of who we are. Now, this sounds similar to Hinduism, right? This idea of finding out who we are. But the answer that the Buddha gives is slightly different than what we see in Hinduism. So, if I were to ask you, where are you? What would you say? Would you say something like, I am at a coffee shop watching this video, I am seated in my chair in my room, I am at the library? What would you say? Now, what makes you believe that? What makes you believe you are there? What is the you that's there? In other words, who are you? Now, for the Buddha, he believes that in order to alleviate suffering, we have to come to a clear understanding of the answers to this question. And when we go through the Eightfold Path, it's going to give us a prescription on how to realize this particular answer. Because when we ask the Buddha, well, who am I? The Buddha is going to say, what you need to do is extinguish your sense of personal identity. You have to come to the realization that this I that you believe has existed from today, from yesterday, from previous days and years, that I that you believe has persisted through time, that's separate from everybody else, this I does not exist. You have to extinguish your sense of a separate, permanently existing or persistently existing through time self. That might be a hard concept to understand, and we'll discuss that and more in the next module. Okay?